So, welcome everybody to this coffee talk from grassroots to mainstream, navigating geographical challenges in grassroots scaling. My name is PJ Beers. I'm with Drift, the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions. And with me here is Katerina Bukoyanis from Ecolise. Also mentioned on this slide is my colleague Simke Nieboer, who has done a great deal of work in preparing the content of this presentation, but unfortunately she will not be here for this event, but I really wanted to highlight her role anyway. Welcome everybody. The talk that we present here is part of a larger project called the Shared Green Deal Project. And in the context of this project, we conducted 24 local experiments. And what do we mean by a local experiment? This could be a community, or maybe a municipality, or a bunch of companies that do something interesting in one of the 6 Green Deal topical areas. This might be clean energy, sustainable mobility, preserving biodiversity, etc., etc. And on the map here, you can see where all these communities initiatives have been situated. And what we find interesting about these is that we can consider them as grassroots initiatives. Basically, they're in some way or the other community-led. And in this talk, we want to talk about how such grassroots initiatives can scale. The content of this talk is also available as of today in a new report titled The Impact of Geographical Enablers and Barriers in the Scaling of Grassroots Innovation Initiatives. So feel free to go and download this report. We would be very happy to do if you do so. That being said, why grassroots experiments? First of all, these grassroots experiments, especially those parts that are related to the Green Deal, can develop and generate all types of innovations. Some of them develop innovative practices, others develop social innovations, so different ways of organizing. Communities can develop technological innovations, and some even develop institutional frameworks. Think, for instance, about community-supported agriculture, where communities or grassroots initiatives experiment with different types of farm ownership. And what's interesting about these grassroots experiments is that they sometimes can experiment with innovations in ways that are very policy relevant, but not available to traditional policy instruments. In so doing, they have a promise of paving the way for further systemic change. But what does it take for them to pave that way? How do they grow? How do they scale? In our research, we've compared the 24 experiments as grassroots initiatives in the Shared Green Deal project, and we studied different types of ways in which they could scale. What you see here on the slide is the framework that we used for that by David Lamb et al. 2020. I'm not going to present the entire framework, but I do want to highlight one important thing, and that is scaling is not just about growing bigger. Compare it like foam bubbles. You can make a very big bubble, but you can also scale or spread by replicating, basically turning bubbles into foam. In some cases, scaling means transferring to different contexts, like the bubbles floating on the wind, and the same grassroots initiative in one place might also be replicated in another. You could also do it slightly differently. You could have a very similar grassroots initiative in the same place, so that you, in fact, from basically maybe an energy experiment to a food experiment to a mobility experiment, etc. And perhaps the most ambitious type of scaling is when you are able to change the underlying rules and values of the place where you are based. So basically in the way that foam might be able to change the rules of a birthday party. What did these experiments do in order to replicate, grow, scale, etc.? We assumed that in order to do so, they needed to navigate all kinds of geographical conditions, and we want to share the results of our research in terms of what these conditions were and whether they helped scaling or whether they presented a barrier to scaling. If it comes to social conditions, we concentrated first on knowledge. We found that misinformation, information overload, basically fake news or the polarization that we've been seeing the past decade or so can hamper community involvement. For instance, when communities might be seen as, well, doing stuff that is not true or would not work. We also saw, on the other hand, that lack of knowledge can actually spark curiosity and help people to engage with local communities. So when there's overload, when there's fake news polarization, it might become more difficult. But on the other hand, communities can also perform an important role in sparking curiosity. When it comes to policies and institutions, we found that they mostly posed barriers to grassroots initiatives and their scaling, especially when it comes to national levels. You can imagine that a policy barrier or institutional barrier at national level is way beyond the direct influence of a grassroots initiative. So basically it's just there and you can't do anything about it. On the other hand, though, when it comes to local conditions, communities might, for instance, strike up relations with policy officers, or even we've seen in the experiments, communities engaging with mayors, local politicians, and via that engagement, they are able to also change their local conditions and make it easier for themselves and for likewise grassroots initiatives to scale. And this already leads into the next part. You need to be a very good networker. If you're able to tap into existing local networks, and especially when these networks are very diverse with very different types of communities, you can also use that as a grassroots initiative to exert further influence on your local conditions. We're seeing, for instance, initiatives in mobility, making coalitions with schools and municipalities to change how children can be dropped off at school. Similarly, when local cross-sectoral collaboration is in place, this will also help you scale. For instance, in doing a similar type of experiment in a different type of area. Furthermore, when it comes to actors and networks, we found that the grassroots initiatives performed important roles in supporting knowledge and change and also empowering local community members. One final type of condition that we studied, and we lumped it together a little bit, is markets and physical conditions. We found hardly any evidence that market conditions would favor local initiatives. And I think in this globalizing world and economy, that's perhaps not what's to be expected. We did, however, find that community networks also can be a site at which local businesses exchange ideas and find ways to grow and scale. And finally, just the fact that you share a geographical location is something that will foster community engagement. Now, this is how we found that the grassroots initiatives navigated geographical conditions. What did we find about how they scaled? First of all, and this is an important part in general, many of these initiatives might share their specific goals right now, but their ambitions often are wider. They often try to go beyond their immediate goals. So if you support the goals of one community, you might be supporting quite a little bit more what happens around that community and its initiatives. Second, if you look at the different types of scaling, I think we saw most of them within only these 24 experiments that we already supported in the Shared Green Deal project. So we did see evidence that there's many types of scaling that these grassroots initiatives are able to execute. When it comes to supporting the local communities, and I didn't say this earlier, but in the Shared Green Deal project, we had 6 very different ways of supporting grassroots initiatives. When it comes to that support, in almost every case, the initiatives showed that they had benefited from that type of support. And our conclusion about that is that these different initiatives they face very different local conditions, local complexities, and in that regard, they can benefit from very different types of support. What you really need is a very diverse set of support principles in place that is able to basically help communities in their specific needs. In terms of institutional barriers, we found mostly that they hamper scaling, and networking can mitigate this, but only to some extent. So if you really want to tap into the power of grassroots initiatives, in the end, the institutional barriers are what you need to focus on for even further scaling. What if you wanted to tap into the power of grassroots initiatives even more? Our research suggests the following recommendations. First of all, you need wider systemic support structures, not only financial support for communities, but also helping them in networking efforts and policy interactions, and ideally a very diverse set of support types tailored to the needs of specific grassroots initiatives. Second, in this promise of systemic change, we think there needs to be EU-level advocacy for the promise of grassroots initiatives. And most interestingly, I believe, because in what they can do, in what their promise is, we could actually see these grassroots initiatives, or the support at least of the grassroots initiatives, as a policy instrument themselves. And on that note, I'm now very happy to give the floor to Katerina Bukoyanis from ECOLEAS, the European Network for Community-Led Initiatives on Climate Change and Sustainability, because they are actually implementing loads of these suggestions already. Katerina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, PJ, and thank you, Shared Green Deal team, for the invitation. And thank you for this amazing report that really resonates with what we do at ECOLEAS. So as PJ said, I'm going to start by introducing ECOLEAS. ECOLEAS is a European network of community-led initiatives for climate change and sustainability. So what we do is we represent hundreds of local projects, national networks, international organizations, from community-supported agriculture in Finland to transition networks in Belgium, permaculture practitioners in Greece, eco-villages in Spain. What unites all these projects is that they're place-based but are globally relevant. And what we like to say is that they're living laboratories of the transition, testing the regenerative solutions on the ground. So why do we do that? We believe that a just and regenerative future within planetary boundaries is only possible through mainstreaming. It's possible through mainstreaming and strengthening transformative and community-led action. So how we do this, our mission is to connect, support, and amplify this ecosystem of community-led action. In order to do that, we work at 3 levels: empowering people, enabling systems, and influencing policy. So this translates as capacity building, financial and structural support, and EU-level advocacy. So in terms of capacity building, which is the first strand of our work, our aim is to build the political and strategic capacity of community-led initiatives, because scaling transformation is not about funding or projects only. It's also about power, narrative, and agency. So through our advocacy trainings, our goal is to equip the change makers with the tools to navigate complex policy systems, to understand who holds influence, when to intervene, how to frame their realities in a way that resonates in Brussels, not just locally. So what we've seen, and what the Shared Green Deal findings confirm, is that communities already know what needs to change. What's missing is the structures and the skills to make institutions listen and learn. So this is what these trainings build. They build the confidence, clarity, and the alliances for the communities to move from being implementers to shapers of policy. And we aim to do that by creating a multiplier effect. So where these trains advocate train others. And so we create open source tools that have been shaped by our person trainings to disseminate the knowledge beyond our closest members. So the second area is financial and structural support. And a good example of this is partly one big part of the Regenerative Communities Fund, which is a new experiment in how to finance grassroots action. So this matters because many community-led initiatives are informal. They may be associations, collectives, or cooperatives that rarely fit into the eligibility criteria of existing EU or national programs, and they rarely have the human power and capacity to do so. So the fund therefore provides early stage and bridging funding through small grants that help initiatives to move from vision to viability, while also offering hands-on mentoring. The third dimension of our work is EU-level advocacy, like PG said. So ECOLEAS aims to act as an interface between community-led realities and the European policymaking. This is not only important to promote community-led initiatives, it's also important because EU policy structures in silos. So food policies here, housing policies there, energy and environment somewhere else, while community life is integrated. For example, when a village sets up a regenerative food system, they're not just addressing agriculture, they're dealing with water use, energy, employment, local culture, education, and all together at once. So we try to translate this integrated place-based logic into sectoral languages that policymakers understand and bring evidence from the ground. A good example of this that I'm very happy to share at this webinar is our policy event next week on community-led food transition, where we've gathered insights from hundreds of local initiatives and we've translated them into 13 key policy areas, from local procurement and agroecology to food democracy and education. So we use these findings to contribute to the EU-level conversation through this, for example, a dialogue at the ESC, or conversations with DG Regio, or collaborations with networks like eClay, CanEurope, Eurocities. By doing so, we demonstrate that supporting grassroots initiative is not just a nice to have, it's a strategic policy tool for innovation, cohesion, and democracy. But as your study shows, bringing the message is not always easy, and we try to translate, like I said, because when we move from community practice to policy language, it's never built to water down some of the radical and relational qualities that make grassroots initiatives transformative in the first place. So in order to keep the transformative edge alive while still making it legible and actionable for institutions, what we do is what we call participatory policy. So we try to make our advocacy participatory by involving communities and co-creating the policy recommendations, not just speaking in their behalf. Finally, I'd like to deeply resonate with the findings of the Shared Green Deal report, which makes one thing clear, that Europe's transition depends on enabling local capacity and in removing institutional barriers. And based on the insights of the report, we do very strongly agree with the need for flexible and inclusive funding that removes bureaucracy from small, informal, pre-legal initiatives. We need intermediary structures like ECLIs to be recognized as bridging infrastructures, linking the communities with the institutions, and maintaining this continuity beyond the lifespan of a project. We need integrated policy frameworks that we need to break some silos, because policy coherence among different sectors and levels of governance is essential. And we need multi-level partnerships in long-term between communities, municipalities, EU institutions, to turn into this experimentation into systemic change. So thank you very, very much, PJ, for this invitation. And looking forward to reading the full.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Katarina. This brings us almost to the end of this coffee talk. Just one or two announcements. First of all, we are launching the Shared Green Society's European Forum for Connecting Practice, Policy and Research. If you're interested, there is a priority registration open already, just for you and not for everybody else yet, for the launch event on the 28th of January 2026 in Brussels. And if you want more information about the forum, its launch, and whatever its goals are, please go to sharedgreensocieties.eu. Finally, this was the 5th installment of a series of coffee talks. And if this coffee talk interests you in one of the other 4 ones, maybe you already were attending that one, you can also go online at sharedgreendeal.eu and learn more about intersectionality in the Green Deal, about governance of local experiments, about justice in the Green Deal, and all kinds of other interesting stuff. Thanks very much for attending this coffee talk.